Hello, I'm Darianne Christian, the chair of the Newfields Board of Trustees, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second session of the Newfields Speaker Series presented by Bank of America. At today's event, we will once again have the opportunity to hear from one of the smartest and most experienced people in our field, and have a conversation about one of the most important questions our society faces, including America's cultural institutions and including Newfields. Specifically, how do we achieve a lasting culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in our organization and beyond? The speaker series is meant to help us find some answers by gathering our board, staff, colleagues, and the public in a dialogue with leaders in our field. Together, we will share ideas on creating more empathetic, inclusive, and community-focused cultural institutions. Our guest today is the best-selling author of The Participatory Museum and The Art of Relevance. She invites us to explore ways that community members can co-create more joyful, welcoming, and enriching cultural experiences. Nina Simon has been described as a museum visionary by the Smithsonian Magazine for her community-based approach to design. She is an Ashoka Fellow, cultural manager, author, and leader in the movement for more inclusive and relevant cultural and civic organizations. Nina is the founder of, For, By All, a global nonprofit that creates digital tools that are helping more than 100 museums, libraries, parks, theaters, and community organizations around the world become more inclusive, relevant, and sustainable. Like you, I am eager to hear what Nina has to tell us. As a reminder, the format of the series is meant to spark discussion. Nina will present, and then there will be time for questions following her presentation. I want to thank you all for coming and for making the Newfields Speaker Series a success. Before we begin, I want to thank our long-standing partner, Bank of America, for sponsoring the Newfields Speaker Series. They continue to support us from our community engagement efforts to our conservation work and serve as presenting sponsor of Winter Lights. Bank of America is committed to DEIA work in the community and with arts organizations, and is the gracious sponsor of this series.
And now, please welcome Nina Simon.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me and hear me and see some slides, hopefully. I am calling in today from the Santa Cruz Mountains in California, the ancestral home of the Awaswas peoples, and I'm really honored to be with you today. I want to thank Lindsay and Garrett for setting us up, and to all of you in advance for your engaged questions, debate, and conversation about today's topic and this whole conversation that's happening at Newfields. So I've been asked to speak today about creating a more participatory institution. As mentioned in the introduction, I'll be giving a presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So I really encourage you to share your questions at any time through the Q&A in Zoom, and then we'll be addressing and digging into those at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to, as was mentioned, just very briefly about my history. I was a museum director at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, also known as the MAH or the MA. I've written 2 books, and then more recently was the founder of By For All, an organization that is working around the world to support museums, libraries, parks, and theaters that are striving to be not just for their communities, but of and by them as well. And today we're really going to talk about participation. And on the most basic level, the way I think about people participating in cultural institutions is this: that when we design for participation, we're inviting people not just to consume and enjoy our exhibits, our content, our expertise, our programming, but to co-create it and to share it as well. You may be familiar with these ideas about the traditional institution being one that delivers content, delivers knowledge, and people come in and consume it and have a great time doing so. versus an institution where people are able also to bring their own stories, their own objects, their own experiences in, and in doing so, shifting the organization. So what might participation look like? It can look like people coming together to co-create art in your space. It can look like visitors being invited to share their own stories in exhibitions. It can look like people using exhibitions or using spaces for their own purposes. It can look like activities outside of the institution, people coming together around their own objects, their own stories, their own heritage. It can look like different kinds of advisors supporting the institution, bringing their ideas, their perspectives on how institutions should move forward. Sometimes those perspectives, sometimes what people bring in may be way beyond what you've been comfortable presenting in the past. Now, I'll note that all the pictures I just shared were from pre-pandemic times, but I've also been seeing institutions apply these ideas of participation in really powerful ways during the pandemic. And just briefly, one that really inspires me, one that we've been working with through Of By For All, is Casa Santa Ana. It's a contemporary art center in Panama City, Panama. And when the pandemic hit, Panama City and the whole country of Panama went to a very extreme version of lockdown where people could only go out a couple of hours per week. So the kind of programming they had been doing in the past, the artist residencies, the film screenings, the speaker series like these could not happen. But they found new ways to be participating with their community. So on the left here, you can see Casa Santa Ana became the first organization in their area to be distributing food, but alongside that food, they were distributing art supplies and sparking guerrilla art projects, family art projects around their neighborhood. They also turned their social media platforms over to local artists and illustrators who were documenting what the pandemic felt like from a Panama City artist perspective. So there are lots of different ways to do participation. And fundamentally, when I think about what differentiates participation from interactivity or other ways of enjoying an institution, it's that participants can actually change the institution. You know, I started my career at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., a very fun, interactive museum, but one where every visitor is treated as a consumer, somebody who's going to have a great experience, but who's not going to leave anything that changes the institution. In fact, we prided ourselves at the Spy Museum on the fact that everything would reset perfectly, that the building would be clean for another visitor to have the same great experience on another day. In a participatory institution, you're not constantly resetting. You're not a clean state for consumption. You're a space that is actively changing based on what people are bringing in. So that may look different ways. Again, at the Oakland Museum of California, when they reinstalled their art galleries, their natural history galleries, and their history galleries, in all cases, they used extensive front-end research in partnership with community members to shift how they reinstalled all of their galleries. And they wrote this book about it, How Visitors Changed Our Museum. It's available for free on the Oakland Museum website. I highly recommend checking it out. In Derby, in the UK, there was a museum that was about to close because of lack of relevance. And they decided, you know what, Derby is a city of making. They were the place that created the first Rolls-Royce airplane engines. They're a place that's known for video game making. And they decided, we are going to invite people in to actually physically rebuild the museum with us. And so everything you see here in this recently opened, they just opened last year, everything you see here in the reopened museum was actually co-built with members of their community. And then you also see ways and opportunities to partner with artists and visitors to co-create projects that could not exist with an artist and an institution alone. And this is a picture from a project quite a while ago, about 10 years ago. The Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK worked with an artist named Sue Lottie, who invited people in this thing called the World Beach Project to make land art by making art on beaches near them and sharing it in this collaborative map. So co-producing art with the artist, facilitated by the institution while doing so. I very deeply have experienced this because when I took over the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, we had this focus on using participation to transform our museum. In that case, we were dealing with bankruptcy. The museum, when I took over, was within a week of closing, and we knew that our only way to move forward was to recreate the museum in a way where people not only enjoyed coming, but felt proud and felt part of what we were creating. So just a sense, of what participation can do. When I came to that museum as its new director in 2011, we had a budget of $700,000 a year. We had 7 staff members. We had 17,000 visitors a year, the majority of whom were school kids and retirees, and almost all white. This is what it looked like my last full fiscal year at the museum. We had grown to a budget of $3 million. We had 40 staff members, and we had 148,000 visitors that year who reflected the age diversity of our county, the income diversity of our county, and the racial ethnic diversity of our city as well. By inviting people to participate, by having them have not just a stake in the institution financially, but creatively and in terms of their own spirit, their own stories, we were able to transform our institution. But what I thought I wanted to focus on today are the challenges of this, because I know that Newfields is going through some incredible change and growth. You may choose to take a participatory path, you may choose to take other paths, but if you choose a participatory path, I felt that what might be most useful for me to share today and really dig in with are some of the big challenges that can come up along the way. And I want to really focus today on 3 challenges, and we're going to go through each in depth, but I just want to introduce them. First, a challenge that when you first invite people to participate, the people you hear from will be the people you have heard from a long time, and it might be hard to reach those who have not engaged in the past. Second, that if you start inviting people to participate, if you start having your institution be changed by that participation, some people who've been involved for a very long time, some people who are from dominant communities with an expectation of what Newfields is, will get confused or uncomfortable. And then finally, we'll talk about this idea that you might be worried about whether what's going to happen is a shift where you just trade the people you used to engage for a new group of people without necessarily seeing growth in a way that is leading to that more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive institution you want to build. So in about the next 40 minutes, I'm going to share some stories and frameworks around each of these 3, and then we'll dive into conversation. So let's start with this first one. People from dominant communities will be faster to participate. I'll just note that I'm going to be using this language of dominant and non-dominant communities throughout this talk. There are a million different ways to describe communities. We're going to talk more about that later today, but I'm using dominant and non-dominant in accordance with what's happening at Newfield around DEIA work, where a dominant community is a community that might have more power within the region, within society, that might be more power because of race, because of class, because of sexual orientation, because of religion, because of ability. And non-dominant communities being communities that might have less power. Then that, again, might be on any of these axes of the different ways that we identify. And so we'll talk more about this, but that's where this language comes from. So let's talk about this problem, right? You've decided you want to hear from a lot of people. This is why this speaker series is happening to some extent, and so many changes, your listening sessions and things like that. When I came to the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, similarly, I knew we had to hear from people who had never felt comfortable in our building or who had never walked through the building before. So on my very first week, the same week I was dealing with the fact that we had no money, the same week that I had to lay people off, it was an incredibly stressful week. But one thing I knew we had to do that week was paint this comment board in the lobby. This is the first version of the board. It looks crappy. It got better over time. But in my very first week, I thought it was important for us to start hearing from people. Now, of course, this was noble, but there was a problem with it, right? Which is, who were the people who we were going to hear from on a comment board in our lobby. We were going to hear from the people who already knew about the museum, who were already coming in. And you'll find again and again that when you invite people to participate, the first people who are going to raise their hand are people who already know you, people who already feel comfortable in your space. And those may not be the people you are most looking to hear from. And so the question I would invite you to think about is this one. Who do you feel is critical to the future of Newfields? And how can you put energy into seeking out, building connections, and hearing from them, even if they are not already involved? And the way I like to think about this is this. I like to imagine that our cities or our regions are made up of many communities in these bubbles. And some of those communities overlap or intersect. Some of them are very far apart from each other. Any organization, any institution has some group of communities who are already involved, who are already excited about what you do. In the context of an arts institution like Newfields, a cultural institution, probably this circle lines up to some extent with the dominant communities in your city. Probably, historically and across our country, people who attend and participate in these institutions are more likely to be white, more likely to be wealthy, more likely to be educated, more likely to fall into certain categories within a constituency that may sometimes not relate to dominance and non-dominance in terms of power, but there are communities who are already comfortable and already feel engaged. And then there might be communities that are of interest for you. Those communities might be ones who are close to walking through your door, but are not yet doing so. Maybe they're physically proximate, people who live in the neighborhood of the institution. Maybe they're conceptually proximate, artists and creators who are living in downtown Indianapolis and trying to make it happen. There may also be communities of interest to you who are further from your institution, who maybe haven't been or had a terrible experience when they came, or perhaps don't even know that Newfields exists. We like to think about this idea of getting very specific about defining communities of interest for you, the communities you want to involve. And we like to think about getting specific in 3 different categories. You can define communities by geography. That might be people who live in a particular neighborhood or people who immigrated from a particular place. There are communities of identity, people who identify in some way with a certain race, a certain religion, a certain sexual orientation, or also even a deeply felt identity, like saying, I am an artist. And there are also communities of affinity, people who like X, people who love a certain sports team, people who are alumni of a certain school. There are overlaps between these different definitional ways of thinking about communities, but in Of By For All, we actually like to encourage people to get very specific in defining communities who you want to engage. The last thing I'll just note about how we define communities, some communities that are very tightly bonded and some that are not. So for example, you might be really interested in teenagers who are creative and who are in schools with a lot of Title I schools, so schools where kids are more likely to be low income. And it may be easy to say, okay, that's this school, this school, this school, and let's look for the art classes, let's look for the clubs. Or you might say, we're really interested in stay-at-home moms who feel isolated. You may not have an obvious place or an obvious leader, community leader with whom you would connect, but that doesn't mean that those people don't exist. I want to show you a couple of the kinds of communities that people in the Of By For All network have worked with. So there was a library in Minnesota that decided to work with Somali mothers of young children in the Burnsville neighborhood. There was an arts institution that said, we're going to focus on Black, Indigenous, and students of color in our local community college who have experience with the justice system. There was another organization that said, we're thinking about Peruvian traditional artists and storytellers who are living in the American Southwest. And the reason we think about getting so specific when we're talking about communities of interest and communities who have not been involved in the past is because when you want to involve a community who have not felt welcome or have not been connected, it's not so easy to just say, hey, we're having a listening session on this day. Why don't you come? Why would they come? Who do they know who's going to be there? Are they going to be respected? Are they going to feel comfortable? There are so many questions for somebody who's new. And similarly, if there are people who have been treated poorly, or if there are people who have been exploited or excluded, to just say, hey, we're welcoming everybody, there's a big buffet laid out, is not necessarily going to get them to the table. But if you say, hey, we're really interested in hearing what matters to you, we're setting this dinner party that is just us and you, we're going to do it in your location at a time that feels comfortable for you, there's a different level of respect. There's a different level of relationship building that happens there that is more likely to get you towards the participation that you seek. So I want to give you an example from a nature center in the Midwest in the US. This was a nature center that had great trails and a beautiful lake. And they found that the people who were always using their space, who felt very comfortable, tended to fall into these different constituencies. People who love to walk their dog, people who love to fish or do bird watching, and most of them were older and white and middle class. So those were the communities who were dominant in their space, communities who participated easily. And they said, you know, we're really interested in some communities who have not been so involved here, particularly families with kids and immigrants. And so we said to them, okay, families is a very big constituency. Immigrants is a very big constituency. Can we get more specific? And as they were talking to community leaders, as they were thinking about it internally, they said, one community of interest for us. We know there are a lot of Hmong immigrants here, and we're interested in families who might already have a pre-existing connection to nature. It's not like they've never had fun in nature before. We're not ready to bridge that, but we're ready to work with, and we think we have a reasonable opportunity to build a relationship with these families. And one of the first, and so what we like to say is that the first thing to do when you're then talking with this community of interest is not to say, hey, do you want to come to our nature center? Hey, we have these hiking trails, they might be interesting for you. Hey, you might want to come to this listening session, but instead to focus on them, to ask what matters to them, not ask how they might get involved with you. To sit down and in some way, probably less awkwardly than these questions, but these are the four big categories we always talk about. Asking, what goals do you have? You know, what are you hoping for? What are you dreaming for yourself, your family, your community? What do you value? What's really important to you? What barriers or challenges are you facing as you think about pursuing those goals or living those values? And what commitments can you make? What feels available to you, and what feels impossible? One of the things we find is that when institutions reach out to communities, we often do a lot of talking about ourselves, the institution, and then sort of offering some free passes. Or perhaps we come in already with an idea of, hey, we have this great idea for a partnership, and we're pitching them on doing something that matters to us or that we've developed. Instead of saying, hey, how can I learn and be curious about you? And then potentially come back with a change or an opportunity or a program or an offering for participation that really relates to your goals and values. So in the case of this nature center, when they had some of these conversations, one of the things that they heard about was they heard about families. I'll go back. We heard about families saying that one thing that was really important to them as a connection with nature was foraging. That a lot of these Hmong parents had, as children, spent time in the forest with their own families, foraging for edible plants. And that was something they really wanted to share with their own children. And then, of course, this nature center had a problem, right? Which is they were very well set up to engage the communities they'd always engaged, the dog walkers, the birders, but they actually had rules against foraging on their property. And it sparked an internal conversation about this question of how did we decide that foraging wasn't okay? And one reason, obviously, or as you might anticipate, was about conservation and about caring for the plants. But then there was a conversation about, wait a second, we let people bring their dogs here, which some might argue has some negative impact on the land. Why are dogs okay and foraging isn't? And the moral of the story is not that dogs are good or bad or foraging is good or bad, but that they had to ask themselves, how did we come to have these rules? How did we come to have these opportunities to participate? And how are those choices influencing who feels welcome, who feels able and eager to participate here? It's not neutral or scientifically based even to say dogs yes, foraging no. It's a conversation that always needs to be had. I'll just say that I am a Reconstructionist Jew. And one thing a rabbi said to me once that I love is tradition gets a vote, but not a veto. And when we're talking about opportunities for communities to participate who may want to participate in ways we haven't before, we have to ask ourselves, is our tradition of saying yes to dogs and no to foraging, is it deeply part of the canon? Is it key to the safety and the quality of what we're offering? Or is it something that developed because we were dog walkers and we were fishermen and birders and we were not foragers when we were children? And I think this really does come back to these elements about dominant and non-dominant communities, because most cultural institutions, Newfields included, were created and founded by people from who are more likely to be white, who are more likely to be wealthy, who are more likely to be offering certain forms of participation that lined up with what they had experienced and loved with their own families for generations. And so as we're thinking about new opportunities for people to participate, we have to also think about the power imbalances structurally that are built into the rules and the ways our organizations operate. And so I invite you to think about, who do you see as critical to the future of Newfields? How can you reach out and learn more about what matters to them, not necessarily relative at the beginning to you? And how can you get really curious about which new opportunities to participate might speak to their goals and values, and which rules or ways participation happens now might be causing barriers or challenges, or might be impossible from a commitments perspective for those communities to engage. So the second challenge here is that if you start to make some of those changes, if you start to say foraging yes, dogs no, or foraging yes, dogs yes, some people are going to get uncomfortable and some people are going to get confused. I have experienced this very personally. Started changing the museum, our little museum. There were political cartoons. This is me yelling at Michelangelo about participation, saying, nice job, but seriously, it's a bit passive. You must engage the visitor. You must think interactive, maybe leave room for visitors to color in your work with crayons or paintball, dumb down your work. This is a classic argument against participation in museums, that it's dumbing down to invite visitors to participate. I don't think that this political cartoonist knew that Michelangelo did not paint the Sistine Chapel entirely alone, but in fact invited a lot of participation in it. But you're going to get this kind of pushback. You might get straight up racist response. This is a caller, as you might imagine, our museum is in California. Our county is 35% Latinx. Our visitation when I started was barely 4% Latinx. We started making a lot of changes, and some people were really angry about it. There were also people who expressed the same kind of feelings, but expressed it differently, basically saying, I love the way that this person ends. This is not elite. This is just the way it is. And I see this as somebody who is so deeply rooted in their dominant mindset of what an art museum exists to do, that the idea that there might be other ways for people to engage, that there might be other ways for an institution to have value, were just not even on her radar. We also have people who were genuinely, and I think very, who were genuinely confused and really trying. When we were working on transformation of our museum, one of the things we did was we built a new theory of change, of what we were trying to achieve. And we really focused on two tracks. One that was about social bridging, so bringing people together across differences in race, in background, in class, to engage around culture. And the other that was about empowering people to share their own stories and their own creativity. And I remember when we came up with this, one trustee said, I get the social bridging and the community stuff, I love it, but I don't really get this empowerment part. I don't come to a museum to be empowered. I had to say to her, okay, but Cynthia, You are the mayor of Santa Cruz. You know, I'm pretty sure you have some other opportunities to be empowered. And what we had to do is we had to listen to the voices of people who were not yet in the room, but people whose voices we had heard that what they valued and the goals they had and the barriers they faced might be seriously impacted if our institution could change in this direction. And these were people like Jasmine Avila. This is from a fundraising email, actually, we sent a couple years into making change. Jasmine was a young Latina librarian in our community. And in this email, she talked about the experience of the MA, the museum really forming a key piece of her life. And she talks about this idea in the beginning. Growing up in LA, I was surrounded by my culture. There were constant reminders of who I am. And she said, you know, Santa Cruz always felt like something was missing. The parts of me were missing, even after living here for 7 years. And she goes on to talk about how the museum became a place where she could share and connect with her culture in a way that had felt missing for her. And again, thinking about dominant and non-dominant, I always like to say that I will welcome the confusion of somebody with power, somebody from a dominant community, if it means the opportunity for participation of somebody who has felt excluded, in this case, not just from this institution, but in the city in which she was living, feeling unwelcome, feeling like some part of her was missing, that it is more important for us to do that work. And that we can work with that trustee to shift that confusion to excitement or curiosity. If you tell the dog walker they can't walk their dog, they are going to be upset, especially if they have been doing it for generations. But if you can either tell the dog walker, hey, you can still walk your dog, just not in this area, because that area is going to be for foraging now. If you can tell the dog walker, hey, we're going to still have dog walking, but we're going to also have foraging, I feel that it is unreasonable in that case for the dog walker to be upset. And you know what? Sometimes you are going to have to tell them no more dogs here. But one of the things we really focused on at the MA was on inviting people who had a certain expectation, people who are from dominant communities, to become more curious, more generous, more brave about experiencing and embracing ways of engaging at the museum that were not the ones that they were familiar with or comfortable with. You know, I remember when we first started doing night festivals that were very family focused and very multicultural. And there were some people who've been involved for a long time who said to me, I don't understand why you're doing these Friday night festivals. And I said to them, you know, it's so interesting because none of the people who are coming on Friday nights say to me, I don't understand why you have an archives, or I don't understand why you're open Tuesday at 2 p.m. I said, those folks are being generous about the idea that this museum exists for many people in different ways at different times. And I hope that maybe you could be generous about that too. And so we were always focusing on this idea with dominant communities of generosity, of curiosity. And it was always my dream, and it happened a lot, that somebody who had a lot of power in the institution would come and would say, gosh, I came to the museum last night. There was something going on that I didn't quite understand. I didn't know anybody who was there, and I loved it. This is exactly what we should be doing. But we had to cultivate the idea that this was something they could get excited about, because frankly, our institutions have spent a very long time telling those folks that everything we have should be for them. And if they don't like it, then we're doing something wrong, not that they should get more curious. This is one of my favorite comment cards we ever had. This first person, these are two different people who've written on this. The first person wrote, what is this, community center or museum? They're expressing confusion, maybe some frustration, but then somebody else has come in and has said, can't it be both? And one of the things we got very into was thinking about new metaphors for our institution as it changed. One of the metaphors comes from the writer Elaine Human-Gurian, who talks about the museum of and we were already a museum of art and history. And so we started leaning into the and saying, it's not like you come for your specific thing on your specific day, but you come for the you come for the fact that there's going to be a music event with opera and ukulele and rap and guitar makers. You come for that intersection. We also used to talk a lot about the idea that the museum was like a restaurant with a very big menu, and that you don't boycott a restaurant usually because there's one thing on the menu you don't like, but you should feel like there's something on the menu you want to eat. And so saying to people, hey, be okay with the fact that there are things happening here that are not for you. Be excited about that, in fact, and know that we're still doing exhibitions. We're still doing all those things that on the menu that have been most important to you. But I will say that, internally we got confused about this. This is a Wall Street Journal article that was written with us as the lead about participatory museum movements around the country. We're a tiny museum in a tiny city that's pretty much only known for surfers and pot smoking. And so to be on the front of the art section of the Wall Street Journal was really quite something. But I've got to tell you that when we saw this graphic that they had created, our first reaction internally, staff and board, was confusion. We asked ourselves, are they making fun of us? Should we be proud of this? Is this who we're trying to be? And we felt this insecurity about it. And then we looked around. This is a graphic portrayal of an exhibition we did, our first community crowdsourced exhibition called Everybody's Ocean. And we looked at how people were engaging in that exhibition, how people were sharing their art, how people were enjoying visiting and seeing the art. People were going deep to explore elements of the art they hadn't seen, how they were reading the labels, how they were experiencing it socially and enjoying it together. And we realized that this image was exactly what we were trying to be. But that didn't mean we didn't have confusion or insecurity along the way. And so as you are changing, there is going to be confusion. There is going to be discomfort. There's even going to be anger. And I think that if you can keep cultivating generosity, and if you can get to a place with yourself where you confront your own confusion and get to a place of confidence about why you're doing what you're doing and why you're proud of it, then you're going to be able to much more confidently and much more genuinely invite others who are confused to become generous enthusiasts as well. Now, the third challenge that I want to talk about is this one, this concern about trading. This comes up a lot where you have this idea that, okay, we've had this constituency we've engaging. We don't want to make a change that just ends up shifting us to look like this. Probably my guess is that if you're here, you want to make a change that ends up looking more like this. Now, how are you going to get there? I think it involves three things. One is the thing we were just talking about, which is about generosity, cultivating this enthusiasm for the idea that different people are here for different reasons and from different perspectives, and that is great. This and as opposed to the targeted or. The second element is blessing and releasing. You will lose some people. It's going to happen. I have gotten the phone call from the biggest donor. In that case, at the time, 87-year-old little fierce white lady telling me, you don't care about art, and I am really upset about it. And I had to learn, I learned this from Cookie Ruiz, who runs Ballet Austin, this phrase, bless and release. And she said, when somebody is so angry, whether it be a donor, a volunteer, a participant, you need to give them permission to go, because part of them is just holding so tightly the fact that they have loved this place, and maybe they have fear that if they leave, the whole thing is going to crash down, and they have to keep fighting for it. This can happen with staff as well. And what I learned from Cookie Ruiz was to say, I appreciate everything you've done for this organization. I see that you are, that it is not the organization that you want to support or be part of right now. I hope you find a place where you can contribute your skills, and they will be lucky to have you. And I have said that to docents, I have said that to donors, I have said that to colleagues, to staff members, I've said that to board members. And there is this almost sense of release and relief, because we are all humans who have a limited time on this planet, and we do not need to spend it bang heads against walls that are not embracing what we have to offer, regardless of what our rationale is there. So I think it's important for us to get comfortable blessing and releasing. I'll just say one more thing about that. I was working with the National Trust in the UK, which is sort of a combination in the US of like the Park Service and historical trust. They run all the big lands and non-castle historic buildings in the UK. And they said to me, you know, we have this problem. All of our members are white pensioners, that means white retirees. And we know that our country, the demographics of our country are moving in a different direction. We have to shift who we're engaging in our membership if we're going to stay relevant. And I said to them, okay, great, that sounds great. I said, what percentage of your current membership are you willing to lose to gain new participants, these new folks who you're interested in? And, you know, I was expecting, that there would be some number, right? Like they don't want it to be 100%. They don't want to lose everybody so that they can, get this new group. I expected it to look a little more like this. And they said to me that if they lost 10% of their current membership, that would be considered a major institutional crisis. And I said to them, I don't know if you're going to be able to make this growth then, because if you're afraid, if you had 100% growth in new members, but you lost 10% to get there, you should be cheering for that. But if you're going to let that 10% hold you back, you will never reach that larger group. So you have to be willing to do some blessing and releasing. And then the last thing I want to talk about is this idea that if you're going to take a participatory approach, you have to build systems of how you work that encourage more participation. You know, there are some systems we have that have a cap, right? If we're going to have 5 exhibitions a year, we can fill 5 exhibition slots. We can't fill 10 exhibition slots. And it's actually a problem for us if we have 10 exhibitions because we don't have the budget, we don't have the resources, we don't have the space for that. Similarly, if you want to, really anything in this world, if you want to encourage more of it, it can't cause you pain to get more of it. Because if it causes you pain to get more of it, you're not going to pursue it. So if you want participation, you have to start building systems that make it easy for you to say yes to every person who wants to come in and get involved. And I want to explain sort of how this looked at the museum. You know, we had this incredible growth in attendance, right? Almost 10x over a number of years. But that masks an even bigger change that happened during this time, which was in the number of partners we worked with, the number of artists who exhibited with us, the number of people with whom we co-produced events. We went from working with about 50 partners a year to 2,000 partners a year. So if you think about this in terms of percentages, to get a 10x growth in visitation or 9x growth, we had to have a 40x growth in the number of partners we worked with. I mean, we did not have a 40x growth in the number of staff. So we had to create new systems so that staff members could work with more participants without it driving us nuts. And so I want to show one example of what this looked like in action. And I'm going to show you an example that involves Dia de los Muertos. As you may know, and it's actually coming up next month, you know, Dia de los Muertos is a festival, an honoring celebration of the dead. It started in Oaxaca and is spread throughout Latin America, and now you see it in many parts of the Americas, including many parts of the US. And it's a day when people make altars. If you've seen the movie Coco, you sort of know what this is about. You make altars, you bring offerings to the dead, and there's a variety of ways that you're doing this celebration. And so when I came to the museum, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we had a county that was 35% Latino. We were doing a Dia de los Muertos celebration, and this is what it looked like. It was in the lobby of the museum. A staff member, our educator, set up this altar, and for a week, people could add to it. There was one night when we had a festival. We had traditional dancing. There was sugar skull making. But there were also some non-traditional things like the limbo. This was a very popular event, especially with families, but it was a white dominant event. Most of the people who came were white. Most of the people who produced the event were white. It was sort of a white idea of Dia de los Muertos. So this is what it looked like when I came. At the time, in 2011, we had no Latinx staff. We had 5 partners who co-produced this exhibition, 4 of whom were white. We had 380 visitors who came to the event on that Friday night, about 300 of whom were white. So here we have an event that was at the time the event that brought in the most Latinx people per year to the museum, this one-off event. But in a town, in a community, a county of 300,000, of whom a third were Latinx, the idea on the biggest day of the year, we had 80 Latinx people coming, did not feel like we were really killing it. And we were really doing it in this way that centered our institutional ability to do it and our white staff and our white partners. So we started making some changes. The first thing we did was we reached out to a Oaxacan organization locally called Senderos. They're a traditional music and dance organization. And we said, hey, we've been doing this Dia de los Muertos celebration for several years, and we'd like to invite you to partner with us. Again, in the beginning, we were very us-centered. We have this event, we want you to partner with us. And they said to us, okay, yeah, we could do that. And the thing that we're really good at, the thing we really care about is music and dance. So we want to bring that into the event. And we said, great. And then they said, it doesn't really make sense to us that you're doing this event indoors at a museum when your museum manages a historic cemetery just a mile away. And traditionally, that's where we would celebrate Dia de los Muertos. So they brought the idea in that we would start at the museum, and then there would be a procession a mile long that would go to this historic cemetery for the celebration. The next form of participation we did was shifting how we did the altars. Remember, we used to build one in the museum in the lobby. Now, instead, we invite people to build their own at the cemetery, throughout the cemetery, so that there are altars instead of just people can bring their own design aesthetic. Many of the people who build altars are Oaxacan or Latinx, but many people who build the altars are not Latinx as well. And as the years went by, it grew and grew from one night and one altar to a celebration that involved a full day and eventually with an overnight of starting at the museum, going to the cemetery, the altars, music, dance, food. There was a dance party at night. There ended up being a sleepover component. It kept growing. As the event changed, it changed really in partnership with our staff changing as well. We had started really to make shifts in who we were hiring, how we were recruiting. And this is the person who actually still runs Dia de los Muertos at the MA. This is Helen Aldana. And I want to be really clear here that Helen is not the right person to run Dia de los Muertos because of being Latina, but being Latina does give Helen some assets that made Helen an incredible partner to all the collaborators with whom Dia de los Muertos is created. First, Helen is bilingual. Many of our partners on Dia de los Muertos are Spanish dominant, and so having a partner who speaks your language is very meaningful. Second, Helen grew up celebrating Dia de los Muertos, which may not sound like a big deal, but let me tell you, I'm Jewish, and while I could put together your Christmas, I probably wouldn't be the best person. I probably couldn't brainstorm based on, oh, I've seen this one, or oh, my family wants this. So that cultural experience helped Helen be a strong partner. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, Helen does not identify as the person who creates Dia de los Muertos. Helen identifies as the person who makes it possible for our partners to create Dia de los Muertos. And Helen really thinks of herself as being behind the scenes, supporting and providing a platform for these things to happen. So when our partners say we want to do a procession, Helen says yes and figures out with the city how to get the permit. When they say we want to bring food and drink, Helen says yes and figures out how we can get the facilities to be able to do that, as opposed to Helen bringing those ideas or guiding it themselves. And here's the change that this looked like in terms of the event and the partnership. So by 2018, we had dramatically changed our staff. We had gotten to a place where we were 50% Latinx. The partners for this event had gone up tenfold, and we're now majority Latinx, majority Oaxacan. And the attendees for the event had grown tremendously as well. And again, now we're mostly Latinx, although I'll note that there were more white people coming in 2018 than had come in 2011. It's just that this had shifted from being a white-centered event to being a Latinx-centered event. And perhaps most importantly, and one of the things that shift made possible, this was no longer the one day of the year where Latinx people felt like they were welcome in the museum. Because of Dia de los Muertos, it became the basis for a series of many different kinds of collaborations. Now, when organizations like Senderos have cultural exchange and have musicians from Oaxaca coming to Santa Cruz, they call and they want to do a tour of the museum because they know that they can get a tour in Spanish. Now, when in 2019, this was when we did a co-produced exhibition project about seniors in isolation, we are calling our partners and our friends in the Oaxacan community to make sure that they're part of it. One of our partners called us and said, you may remember when there were all of the Families Belong Together rallied, hey, how to do this downtown, can you help us? This was actually a really hot moment for us because we were being tested by our collaborators to say, will we support something political in our space? Will we do this? Is this part of what it means to participate at the museum? And the conversation inside with the staff and the board went like this. We said, these are partners who are very important to us. They're telling us what matters to them and what matters to the future of their community. And that in turn matters to the future of all our community. And if we say we are a place that empowers people to share their voice, if we say we are a place that brings people together across differences, then it is appropriate and maybe even meaningful for us to pull the permits for this rally, to be the place where you can get walk to the bathroom as part of it, to be a safe supporter of this project. And this means that now, it created that huge transformation in attendance, and that people are coming and using the museum as their place to celebrate, whether that's after a show that they've done somewhere else, as in this picture, or a quinceañera, or a wedding, or just to enjoy the museum on the weekend. And I'm about to share this model that this fits into, but that I want to leave you with. When I think about what it means to build a participatory institution, it's one where visitors and participants are going to take you towards doing things that you might not have done before, that you might not even be sure if you're ready to do or ready to say yes to, but you do because you have created systems to support participants and to support their journey in partnership with your institution. And the kind of structure we use for this is this idea, this framework of risk takers and space makers, and a person named Beck Tench. These are slides that I showed every new staff member at the museum. We said, you may identify as a risk taker. And being a risk taker is incredibly important. Being somebody who's ready to take a chance, who's ready to do something creative, who's ready to pitch your idea. But every risk taker needs a space maker. Every risk taker needs somebody who's going to listen to that idea, even if it's half-baked or messy, who's going to say, yes, I believe in you, even if you don't know how to make a great exhibition, or I'm not really sure about this teen film festival, or I don't know about foraging. Somebody who's going to give the space and say, yeah, let's try it. Yes, I support you. And what we used to say to new staff members is we said, you're going to start here as a risk taker, but you will be successful here if you become a space maker for others, for your interns, for volunteers, for visitors, for participants who come in and who want to be able to get involved. And if we are going to build a strong institution, it's not going to be based on the risks that we individually take as staff or board members. It's going to be based on the extent to which we are able to make space for others, for those artists, for those creators, for those people with really weird ideas to come in and be supported in taking risks and bringing creativity and energy in. And so I'm going to close it there. I'm going to invite you to think about how you might make space for others to bring their ideas, their creative energy, their excitement into this work, this important work that you're doing at Newfields. So I'm going to stop sharing slides. I'm going to do a quick screen shift here, but we're going to invite your questions here in just a moment. Okay. I think we're ready for questions. You can hear me, yes? Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a first question, a great question that says, I'm concerned with our ability to sustain genuine relationships with partners. Staff at all levels are at capacity, and so often these initiatives are additive. What is your advice on how institutions edit projects in order to appropriately support growing these new relationships? Great question. Yes, and it does take not just time, but frankly, it often takes skill building. And that's, a lot of what Of By For All does is there are a lot of organizations that say, we want to start working in this way, but that's not what we're skilled at. So it's not just the time to build the relationships, but maybe also the time to build the competency and the confidence to go out and build those relationships. So that means one thing, when you think about this idea of what it means to be a space maker, a way you make space is by saying no to things. A lot of us are really bad at that. And a lot of us wish that our bosses could do it for us. And so I think if you are somebody's manager, asking yourself, if this is important to you, building community relationships, what am I going to take off of my staff's plate to make this possible? But then also relatedly, how am I going to be real about what kinds of relationships are and aren't available to us? And I'll give you an example. At our museum, at one point we had a staff member who was running youth programs who came to us and said, I want to engage teens. I feel like we really haven't done a great job with teens. And we said, and she said she had an idea for a teen program she wanted to start. And we said, okay, go ahead and try it. And she had some capacity to do so at first. And then she created this program that was really successful. But what it was really great at doing was supporting 15 teenagers very deeply to get involved with the museum. And it ended up taking about a third of her time. And we were a small museum. She was running all youth programs. And she wanted it to take up more of her time. And we said to her, hey, that's not something that organizations can support. But I'm not sure also if one staff member working deeply with 15 teenagers reflects our values and our mission about empowerment and about bridging. And we challenged her and we said, what if you had more time for a short period of time to support transitioning to this to being a youth-driven effort where you're doing minimal support to these partners, kind of like Helen pulling the permits, but not designing the whole event. How can we create a situation where the teens are running this program and are having that fuller co-creation experience and where you're supporting them so that you also have capacity to support others as well? It was a hard transition, I won't lie about that, but it was a transition that led from a half-time person working with 15 staff to a person being able to spend a much smaller percent of her time, about a day a week, supporting about 12 teens who ended up then creating programming for a couple hundred teens, and it was more sustainable. So I think that it's not obvious that every participatory program has to involve you being one-on-one deeply in relation with participants. You have to build relationships and build trust, but then actually if you can build systems that invite more participants or more participant leadership, you're entering into a different relationship. It involves less of your time and more of your trust. And I think dirty truth a lot of times about museum professionals in particular is, well, no, not actually in particular. I've seen this with scientists. I've seen this with librarians like nuts. Sometimes we'd rather spend more time and have more control. And I think one of the things that's hard to do is to cultivate what am I willing to let go of? What am I willing to trust instead of putting in all my time to own and to control this? There's a related question here along the same vein. In my experience, time seems to be a great barrier. We don't estimate how much longer it takes to be intentional and inclusive. We just don't make the time. How can we convince folks that want to invest in DEI AI that they need to understand the time budget as much as the money budget for such undertakings? Great question, comes up all the time. And I think that there's two pieces to it. One is, it is buried in your question, which is how can you ask for the time along with the money? I think a lot of times, I know when I was an exhibit designer, a lot of times I would, to try to get something through, I might really downplay how much it was going to take. I might say, hey, I need this much money, but then I can figure it out. And I think that thinking about what is the whole cost when you're bringing this forward to somebody, it might be scarier because you might be afraid that you're going to get a no, but it's also giving them a better expectation of what's happening. And if you get the yes, you're better supported. But the other thing I think that particularly comes up with DEAI is that there is a sort of sense, a very legitimate sense that, hey, this is very process-based, this is very relational. And so how do we understand what we're going to get out of it? And so from a manager perspective, when the request comes in, you're trying to figure out, what am I going to get for this resource allocation? Am I going to get visitors from new places? Am I going to get more confidence that we're not going to get called out and slammed? What am I going to get out of it? And even though it's deeply uncomfortable often to talk about DEAI in terms of outcomes, I think that adopting some of the language of being able to connect the dots of, hey, if I'm able to put in this time to build these relationships, this is where it could go. I also think about, in that same vein, the CEO of Buy for All, Courtney Harge, she often talks about flipping it and saying, what's the cost to us if we keep being as racist as we are, or if we keep being as exclusionary as we are? And are we willing to pay that cost? I think that we all conceptually have the sense that, yes, we'd like people from different communities here, or yes, we'd like to have a more diverse staff, or yes, we'd like to be a place that's really seen as a leader in equity or anti-racism, but we're not necessarily thinking about what's the value we would put on that, and then what is the budget or the resources we should assign accordingly. So I think that if you can, one of the things, actually, the way the Buy for All program works intentionally is you start by creating a vision and saying to yourself, in 5 to 10 years, if we put all the resources we want and had all the success building more equitable and inclusive systems, what will it look like? And it's actually often quite a hard question to ask. And so often we talk in this relational process way about, hey, we're just at the beginning, this is going to be a long journey, we don't know where it'll lead us. And that may all be true, but anybody who's on this call who's a fundraiser knows if you're going to sell something, you need to have some shiny thing. And so thinking about, what is that vision? What am I trying to achieve? And then how can I communicate that up so that people will get excited about supporting it and be more understanding of the resources that might take to get there? And you probably shouldn't say that vision is that X% of people will Y% and do this. But actually, I've seen it be quite effective. The Oakland Museum did this and we emulated it. Their director for years said, our goal, success for us looks like our audience reflecting the race, ethnic makeup of Oakland. It was a very simple statement. It didn't presume anything about how they would achieve that goal, but it created a sense of what success might look like. And also note that she talked about composition, not about numbers. So again, there's different ways to do this, but having some vision of what will it look like so that people know what they're buying, whether they're buying it as your manager by allocating your time to it, or whether they're buying it as a donor, can be very powerful, even if it's still very broad strokes. Okay, there's another question here. How do we get our leadership? Sorry, I'm in the sun, so I'm gonna move this so it doesn't overheat. How do we get our leadership to set aside institutional ego and commit to actual meaningful change towards being a more inclusive and collaborative space? I think this question, the answer to it is very related to the last one, in that we are all on some level self-interested. And if you're identifying ego as something that's there, then there's certainly self-interest, and you already know that. So how can that person win through this? Is that person somebody who might be excited to be seen as a leader? One way we often do visioning is to say, what's the headline you want to see 5 to 10 years from now about the institution? What do you want to see in the paper coming in that is laudatory about what's changed? And being able to speak to that leader's desire, Maybe it's for fame and success in that way. Maybe it's for, a sense that the institution will be seen in a certain way. I often say that if you can frame what you're trying to do in the language of the people who have power, it may feel odious to you to do so, but it is very effective. Because you're not making that person guess why this is going to be useful towards their goals or towards what matters to them. And actually, those 4 questions I brought up earlier, what goals do you have? What do you value? What barriers or challenges do you face? And what commitments can you make? We actually have heard from some organizations we've worked with who've said, gosh, I've mostly been using those questions with these communities of interest who we're working with. But I had one person who said, I used those questions with a board member who was really resistant, and it fundamentally shifted the conversation, because once I understood what that person's goals were and what they were afraid of or what barriers they felt like they faced, I could frame how I was presenting this in a way that was so much more clearly connected to what they might consider to be a win. Okay, I have a couple more questions here. Oh, sorry. Yes, okay, wait, I have another question. Okay. What advice would you give Newfields or any other museum as they're trying to rebrand themselves? It's interesting, this question and the term rebrand, because of course, Newfields is a perfect example of an entity that actually did rebrand in the formal sense of the term, but now is thinking about what does it mean to live into a new brand or a new story, or potentially even to shift that brand and story again. And the advice I would give is something I learned through making, I want to share a couple of different things. The first is something I learned from making a big error. When I first came to the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, it was on the brink of closure. And I felt like it was pretty obvious, financially, if no other way, that this museum was a failing museum. And in the beginning, I would say that. I would say, this institution has been failing our public. We've been failing, to be viable as a nonprofit. I would say we have been under-delivering on public value, and we need to start changing that, and we need to start over-delivering. Donors love this language. The paper loved this language. The people who've been involved for a long time with the museum hated this language. And I always remember a brave staff member who said to me, when you say the museum's failing, what I hear is I'm failing. Or what I hear is the sweat I put in when things were so hard and we were going downhill and you weren't here, Nina. You're telling me that that was a waste and that I was failing. And that was a real wake-up call for me about how we think about language and how we think about the stories we all tell ourselves about the hard work we're doing to make this institution better. And we ended up shifting to saying, this institution was using a traditional model that doesn't work for our community today. And so we're going to shift to a different model. So trying to not center it, trying to let the institution not be the people, but let people opt in to being part of the changing institution. So that's one thing I'd say. And again, also the bless and release thing is huge. There's so many institutions, and it relates to space making too. There's so many people who say they're ready to bless and release, or there's so many people who say they're ready to make space, and then they do the opposite. This is a minor story, but I remember once I wanted to have a finance committee meeting of my board at the library. They were a new partner of ours. They said they were trying to have more social stuff in the library. And I was like, okay, cool. I want to support that. And so I did my homework. I went to the branch 2 days before the finance committee meeting. I said, hey, I know you're doing more social stuff. I'd like to have a finance committee meeting here. Is there a best place for me to do that? It wasn't something I needed bookable. It was just 3 people. And they said, oh, no problem. Yeah, you can do it at that table over there. Right. I come back 2 days later with my board treasurer and my board chair. And we sit at the table we've been told to, and we start having this meeting. And a librarian comes over, very apologetic, about 10 minutes in, and says, I'm sorry, but some people are complaining about you guys talking. And we were like talking very low. We were practically whispering, and we ended up leaving. And I remember feeling embarrassed, feeling frustrated. And obviously, I am not somebody from a non-dominant group, But it was an example where this librarian just 2 days earlier had espoused to me an energy and an enthusiasm for making space for this kind of activity. But when somebody had a complaint about it, he immediately jumped to defend that complainer as opposed to defending the activity that he says he wants. You can imagine that I never wanted to have a finance committee meeting in the library again. I didn't trust, even if they said we want it to happen, I didn't trust it. And the reason I tell this whole silly little story is that I think that when we're trying to rebrand ourselves, you have to really be fierce about defending the new thing you're trying to do, because it will be so easy for you to fall back and listen to or give credence to the dominant voice that says they don't like it. It will be easy to say, sorry, you can't have your meeting here after all. And those people will get up and leave and they won't complain the way the other person complained. But you will not make the change. So you have to be ready to make that space and hold the space firmly and passionately if you want that to happen. Now, I realize the other thing I want to say about this rebranding is you may be thinking, gosh, Nina, you worked at a really small institution and Newfields is big. And I'll say that I've had the privilege to consult with some very large museums making change. And one of the ones that impressed me the most, well, there are many that impress me right now. I'll just say the Oakland Museum of California, YBCA under Deb Cullinan, what Christy Coleman is doing at Civil War Museum. I think that there's some incredible work going on. One of the ones that impressed me most, though, was one I saw about 10 years ago. I was doing some in-house consultation. Oh, Kaywin Feldman, what she did at MIA and what she's trying to do at National Gallery, amazing. But anyway, 10 years ago, I was in New Zealand at the Auckland War Memorial, which was being run at the time by this woman named Vonda. And I was brought in to consult and to do some workshops around participation. And I remember I was amazed to see that they were doing change work, and they started with an internal rebrand for a year before they ever did anything externally. And she said to me, you know, I feel like my job, this institution has been here. My job is to swing the pendulum to here. And either it's going to work and they're going to love me and I'm going to stay, or I'm going to get fired. But either way, after I leave, my goal in the long term is for the institution to end here. She was fired. And the institution still advanced based on the work that she did. And I guess the reason I tell the story is I think that when we're thinking about making major institutional change, it often involves radical acts of courage. I would encourage you, if you have more power within the institution, whether that's based on your position, whether that's based on your tenure, whether that's based on the color of your skin, how tall you are, or whatever that might be, I encourage you to use that power to push for radical change, to make space for risk takers, to amplify when somebody else says something who has less power than you and they aren't heard, to say, hey, I want to go back to what Antonia just said, or hey, I think that Janelle has an important point here and I want to reinforce it. And then when that person says to you, wow, that's really brilliant, that you say, yeah, Janelle has been talking about this. I think we should be listening to them. So I think that it's on all of us to think about how we can use whatever power we have, because we all have power, to push for the change we want, to be dogmatic about holding the space for that change, and to be uplifting and really listening to and supporting the voices of those within our institutions who may have had less power, who may have not had dominance, but who may have a lot of the vision and the energy and the creative ideas that they've been throwing against brick walls or against angry response or no response, but that can really push us and can push Newfields to be the institution that you most hope and aspire for it to be. I think we're going to wrap on questions there. I just want to again say thank you. I want to encourage you, if you were going to do just one thing tomorrow, I would encourage you by yourself to sit down and think about that question of 5 to 10 years from now. In your best possible scenario, what's happening at Newfields? Who's there? How are they participating? What are they saying about their experience 5 to 10 years from now? And then if you want, just put that away in your journal. If you're brave, find a colleague, find another person who's participating in these speaker series and share it with them. If you're really brave, think about who might be critical to making that possible and how you might engage them. But I think that especially when times are hard, and there is no question on every level, times are hard right now, having that vision of what would great look like? What is that radical future you want to see? That is what's going to propel you forward, and that is what's going to make change possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay and again say thank you.
Thank you, Nina. This is Lindsay Hammond, the Director of Public Programs at Newfields. On behalf of Newfields, I want to thank Nina for sharing her time, expertise, and insight with us today. We look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, for their support of the Newfields Speaker Series. And we would like to thank you, our members, public, staff, board, docents, and volunteers for joining us as we work to become a more empathetic, inclusive, and community-focused institution. Today's presentation will be added to our Newfields Speaker Series webpage, where you can also find updates on future conversations. You will receive a survey by email asking for your reflections on today's conversation. Your input is invaluable to us, and we hope to hear from you. We thank you for joining us. This concludes today's presentation.